welcome once again. Thanks for joining the session. I'm really happy to be able to talk to you about this topic, which is really one of my core research areas. So I want to talk to you. Social issues can be many things, and I specifically want to talk about human rights as, I guess, one of the core components of the S in ESG, or within sustainability, the social dimension, if you like. Human rights are a really core component. And as many of you will know, it's also now going to be a regulatory requirement in the EU to report on human rights due diligence and to conduct human rights due diligence. As you probably also know, more recently, there have been regulatory developments to maybe change the timelines and also change the scope, but still the regulatory frameworks, the core of the regulatory frameworks will remain in place. And so the due diligence process will become more important for companies going forward. And multi-stakeholder governance is a really interesting and important mechanism for enhancing social standards in supply chains. And that's what I want to talk to you about. So I am a professor at the Business School at Trinity College Dublin. I lead several programs in the postgraduate space around sustainable and responsible business. We have a master's program on the executive education level. We have micro-credential short courses and also a PG Cert, which is kind of a one-year-long sustainability in business program. So I'm also quite strongly involved in teaching. But let's dive into this topic. So human rights, obviously, the core reference point is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You can see Eleanor Roosevelt here holding up this declaration, a landmark achievement at the time. But interestingly, the connection to business between human rights and business activity has not been made for many decades since this Universal Declaration was adopted by the UN General Assembly. It was thought of more as something that nation states need to focus on, that regulatory frameworks need to include, and not necessarily something that businesses have a specific responsibility for. However, due to globalization, what we have seen is that obviously supply chains became much more interconnected, stretching across different regulatory areas, stretching across different states of development, and also then different human rights standards, which brought this topic more to the forefront over the years. And if we look at a recent report around human rights in business, it's also clear that many of the human rights are actually connected to business activity and can be adversely affected by business activity. So it's not a strange thought to connect human rights with business responsibilities. As you can see here, businesses have faced allegations around human rights violations in several important areas: child labor, forced labor, freedom of association, discrimination, health and safety. So these are real complaints that have been filed against a set of companies that was part of this benchmarking study. And if we look at the geographical composition of these allegations, it's also clear that it's not only emerging economies or kind of weak states that have these issues, but it's actually really a global phenomenon. And supply chains then touch upon human rights issues and are exposed to human rights risks. And that's where a due diligence process can be really helpful and important. So prior to the regulatory developments of the past year, actually, so they passed this due diligence regulation in Europe really just before the last parliament was finished, and it was already almost not getting passed. Now they're probably going to implement some changes, but prior to this regulation, we already had a guiding framework around human rights due diligence, which kind of brought this concept to the forefront of the global discussion, and also introduced a framework. How do we think about human rights and business? How do we delineate responsibilities between states and business on this important topic? And that's what the UN Guiding Principles are for. They were adopted in 2011 the UN Human Rights Council and are a voluntary guidance document which had incredible influence across the globe in the 10 years and more after this document has been brought forward. You can see John Ruggie here, who was a professor in the United States, who was very important in shepherding this complex document through the UN institution and finally getting it adopted. And it is really the landmark document, and it had a strong influence on regulatory frameworks all across the globe, and particularly in Europe since then. And what you can see here as well is that the Irish government, as have many other governments, took kind of inspiration from these guiding principles and put out an implementation plan and set up an implementation group. How can the guiding principles be implemented in the Irish context, and what kind of implications does this have for business, and what kind of guidance can be provided? And this was done prior to the legislation that the EU is now introducing. You can see that this document kind of has a time frame to 2020, and now everybody is waiting for how the regulation ends up looking like. So the guiding principles at the core have this three-pronged approach: protect, respect, remedy. The responsibility to protect human rights lies with the state. And businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights through, at the core, a due diligence process that they need to implement, and remediation, so providing access to remedy for victims, providing avenues to seek restitution and seek justice, is a joint responsibility. So that's the core idea that the guiding principles proposed, and that influenced regulatory frameworks in this area then since 2011 when it was introduced. So if we look at how well have businesses since 2011 implemented the guiding principles and the due diligence requirements, the best way to understand this question is the human rights benchmark. That's an initiative that is out there for several years now, and they annually pick different industries, look at the biggest multinational companies and how well they report on the UN guiding principles. And you can see from a study from 2022, 100 is the maximum score you can get. So the highest scoring companies rank at about half the points, or even below. In the automotive industry, nobody is even reaching half, as is in the ICT sector. If we look at textiles, in 2023, a focus was on apparel companies. You can see there that the highest ranking companies as well only reach about half the points. And some candidates like H&M that we all know, or Associated British Foods, which is also Primark, score significantly lower. So this benchmark, we at Trinity Business School, the Center for Social Innovation, we have done a study now for several times to apply this methodology of the benchmark for the Irish context. How are the biggest Irish companies doing? And we did our last study in 2023 with kind of similar results. A few companies actually doing a bit better. Over time, there's also a trend line that we see an improvement. And the expectation certainly is that this will now accelerate as there will be hard regulation coming down the tracks. But still, most businesses do not have it on the radar, or are scoring rather low in terms of their due diligence reporting. So if we look at the regulatory trajectory, I mentioned that this, the core idea how to operationalize human rights in supply chains through a due diligence process was proposed with the guiding principles in 2011. And you can see in the timeline below that there was a strong influence of this framework. Most notably, the UK Modern Slavery Act was an important point in the European context, but also in the US already shortly after. You had a Californian regulation. The Dutch, the German regulators Since then, also the timeline ends here at 2019, but there were further regulatory developments in Germany, for example, and in France in 2017. And then now in 2024, we had this due diligence law in the European Union. So it's a strong track record of this document. So if we look at what are the core tools that a due diligence process needs to include, the core part of due diligence is an impact assessment of human rights. So identifying human rights impacts and prioritizing. In a complex supply chain, you will not be able to start this process kind of comprehensively. You need to focus. And you can do that by looking at a kind of country context as a starting point to say, where is exposure because of known issues in the regulatory or enforcement area, or social customs, corruption risks, where you can have indicators around countries in that regard to know where should we prioritize. And then it's about scale, scope, and remediability in terms of criteria for prioritization. So how serious is the human rights violation? How widespread is the impact? And how hard would it be to remedy? And on those criteria, you can start to prioritize and set up measures in that regard. So this is a busy slide. The kind of core of the due diligence process, the OECD has a great guidance on that. The OECD has a responsible business conduct guidance for many years, and they included human rights and human rights due diligence in there and have a specific guide on due diligence. So if you're interested in this, my strong recommendation is take a look at it. This is really a very good guidance document. But the core points about this framework are kind of assessing the current situation on the basis of identifying risks and prioritizing. That's very important. And then also understanding the impact. How are you connected to the impact in your supply chain? Then identifying an action plan based on those findings, the high priority items, how can you address them? How can you collaborate with a supplier that you have identified as being exposed to higher risks? Specific actions need to be taken and followed up on. You need to track the progress and set specific targets. And then it's also about reporting, so communicating regularly in specific human rights due diligence reports or human rights reports or sections within an ESG or sustainability report to talk about human rights, where you would show the findings and what has happened since. And what is a very important step is stakeholder engagement throughout the process, because in the end, it's about the affected stakeholders. You need to understand their needs, and that's very important. So that's kind of, in short, in a nutshell, what the due diligence process looks like. And it's obvious that it is a quite intensive, complicated process. And for many companies, it will also be difficult to carry this out alone, influencing conditions on the supplier side. And so I want to look into a mechanism that can help companies achieve that. And that is multi-stakeholder governance, multi-stakeholder initiatives, which are private governance mechanisms that combine different affected stakeholders to address a common social or environmental challenge. And I want to speak about the fact that this has become a quite prominent part of governance. Many MSIs have been founded over the past 20 years, usually with a combination of industry and civil society organizations targeting specific industries. So you can see that agriculture, forestry, fishing, mining, and energy and consumer goods make up almost 2/3 of MSIs that have been created over the past years. And they have become an important tool, and they can help human rights due diligence in an important way. And I want to explain this by talking about a case example to make it a bit more specific and tangible. And that's a scenario and an initiative that I have studied in depth in my own research. Many of you might remember this picture. It might evoke something, either because you remember the original incident in 2013, the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh, or because you remember in 2023, the 10-year anniversary was kind of a media event, if you like, with reports in newspapers and also many kind of TV media. What happened 10 years on? Have things improved? And this incident for the fashion industry in Europe was a big crisis moment. Many of the big fast fashion brands like H&M, for example, were under huge pressure when this happened, because civil society organizations and media kind of saw this as what it was, the fact that really, really dangerous working conditions are tolerated by companies, and that this should not have happened. And so as a reaction to this crisis, an initiative was created that was called the Bangladesh Accord and is now called the International Accord for Fire and Building Safety. And how does this multi-stakeholder initiative work and help with due diligence? It's a collective mechanism. So it's basically companies as signatories, trade unions, global trade unions were a key civil society organization that kind of put pressure on companies to start this initiative. And so they were part of the steering group of this initiative, but the operational entities were the companies that had supply chain links to Bangladesh. And they basically committed by joining this initiative to creating a joint database of the factories involved. Each company that joined this initiative brought their supply chain with them, and then the suppliers needed to comply with these processes. So there were initial inspections, follow-up reports, corrective action plans, and then brands were responsible to, in their day-to-day engagements, make sure that these actions are carried out over time by the factories. And the other component was not only independent inspections, but also worker empowerment on the ground. Safety training. The initiative carried out safety trainings for workers to make them aware of critical risks, how to spot an issue. And they also aim for creating what they called safety committees at the factory level to give workers a voice in the process. And they also had a complaints mechanism that was introduced so that workers were able to voice issues anonymously towards the initiative office in Bangladesh, which then were be able to follow up. So basically what this multi-stakeholder process created is a mechanism to ensure factory safety as collectively rather than individually. And you can imagine, as a single company that sources from Bangladesh, having influence on your supplier to change things on the factory level is quite hard. You only have influence if you are a very important customer, and then even then it might be hard to convince them. But if you have collective force, then you can affect change and you can pool resources, and you can then create this mechanism that is actually connected to the ground, which is the most important thing in the end to achieve results. So that's why it can be a very effective way to do due diligence. And just kind of to close, it's obviously an initiative that is quite a complex nexus of actors brought together, but it was very successful. So it started in 2013. It was with a 5-year initial remit. It was then extended for a few years. And then interestingly, the core task of the initiative to have oversight over building and electrical and fire safety was handed over to a government agency in Bangladesh, but the initiative decided to continue to work in Bangladesh, but then also to extend their approach now under the label International Accord into other textile production hubs. Currently, they started operating for the last couple of years in Pakistan, for example. So it's also an approach that is extended in other countries. And it was quite successful in terms of really changing, improving the conditions, that they were able over these years to really achieve substantial improvements in worker safety. Almost all factories had improvements done. No further incident like this happened in Bangladesh, fortunately, since then. So it is a really effective mechanism. But as this kind of chart shows, it's also obviously complex to manage these stakeholder relationships because there are many players involved. At the core, you have the global brands and companies signing up together with the global unions creating this initiative. And then you have the stakeholders on the ground who are indirectly involved. So the factories, the workers, and the Bangladeshi trade unions. And they obviously are connected with a commercial relationship first and foremost to the companies that are part of the accord. But obviously the regulatory agencies as well as the industry associations are powerful players as well. And Bangladesh, you might know that the textile industry is the most important industry for the country, responsible for the strong economic growth that the country has seen over the past years. So it is an important industry, and obviously it was watched quite skeptically in the beginning by the industry associations and the government. But over the years, they came around to recognizing that it's actually an effective mechanism. It didn't cost them competitiveness, and it was actually an effective way to handle this. And with this, I'm happy to end my talk here and open it up for questions if there are any.
Dr. Maximilian, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. I think it's amazing this strength that the multi-stakeholders can have together, and it goes back to, you know, you're better together than one individual. So thank you for that, and that was an amazing example at the end. Thank you. Do you have time for a quick question? I know you have to go run off to a lecture, but maybe we'll just have one. And have one here. Given the often conflicting interests between the profit-driven corporations and rights-based NGOs or civil society actors, what mechanisms or incentives have you found most effective in fostering genuine collaboration rather than kind of symbolic kind of compliance?
Yeah, so I think the Accord is a good example there. So unfortunately, what still is the bitter reality, without this tragedy, this initiative would not have been started.
Yeah.
Even if most companies that I talk to say it was a success, they had a lot of concerns going in, but actually it worked great, and they would be eager to kind of extend this in other countries, but it wasn't an attractive proposition prior to such an incident. So I think public pressure, civil society pressure is still an important point. However, I think the recognition that these kind of approaches can actually work is becoming more widespread among businesses. And as you have these regulatory frameworks coming in, companies are seeking mechanisms where they can join an initiative that can then help them in carrying out some of these due diligence requirements. And obviously the Accord is now a set up process, and it makes it certainly easier to do this. And the other thing I would say is that what the Accord also shows is to have genuine commitment within the initiative. It's important to be transparent. So the Accord has had a very strong focus on transparency. So all the supplier audits with photos and reports were publicly available. They did quarterly reports on how well the initiative was doing and how well this was carried out. And what is also important, as part of this agreement, companies committed themselves to a legally binding mechanism, which means non-compliance. They decided that there is an arbitration court in the Netherlands that they subject themselves to settle controversies or cases where companies actually have not followed up with their commitments. In the beginning of the accord, there were a few cases that actually went there, but I think it is another element that needs to be there. So what I would say in closing is really, multi-stakeholder initiatives are also not the silver bullet, but they need to be designed properly. And if they are, and the accord is widely considered as a best practice in this sense, they can be very effective. And that's clearly what we can see here.
Okay, well, look, I think that was an excellent summary, and it was a great question actually at the end. So, Dr. Maximilian Schormair, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it, and we thank all our listeners and for our questions as well. And we are going into our next talk at 3 o'clock, delivering during disruption, visibility, transparency, and transformation, with speaker Patrick Van Hull. So we hope to see some of our guests there, our participants there. And again, Dr. Maximilian, we'd like to really thank you for your time again today.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed it. All the best to everyone. Enjoy the rest of the sessions. Bye-bye. All the best.
Bye. Bye-bye.